It really is a great pleasure for me to introduce our guests tonight. We first met when we both had a somewhat darker mane on top of our heads way back in 1959 and 1960. The Baltimore Sun and TASS news agency had offices in the same building, the Reuters building on Fleet Street, and I got to know Nick and his wife, and we had good times together and covered a lot of interesting events way back in the Macmillan era, which takes us back a long way. Nikolay Turkatenko was born in 1928, which Sheila notes is a vintage year. He graduated from the Moscow Institute for International Relations in 1952. He worked for TASS from 1952 to 1973 in London, in New York, and in East and West Africa. He then went back to Moscow, where he was editor of a journal called USA Economics, Politics, Ideology. It's the journal of the U.S.-Canada Studies Institute of the Academy of Sciences of the U.S.S.R. Having buried himself in academia for an unconscionably long period of time, he returned to the real world as head of the TASS Bureau in Washington in 1984. His bureau is the largest news bureau maintained by TASS anywhere in the world, and as we can all understand, it is an extraordinarily important bureau for TASS. We happened to meet one another while attending a seminar by the American Enterprise Institute, which is somewhat different from the ideology that Mr. Turkatenko is associated with. He has written extensively on U.S.-Soviet-American relations, on political and economic affairs, and on the problems of U.S. transnational corporations. I think we're particularly fortunate in having Nikolay with us tonight because of the, as Brad Jacobs would say, the exquisite timing of this meeting, in that he comes to us right after the 27th Congress, Soviet Congress. He can give us his interpretation, and I hope he will, of the essential new developments of that Congress. He also comes to us as Mr. Gorbachev is ending his first year in office, and I'm sure we'll be very interested in his assessment of what changes Mr. Gorbachev symbolizes in the Soviet Union. It's a really great personal pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Mr. Nikolay Turkatenko.
Good evening, and thank you very much for having me here. I'm a little bit frightened by scale of this hall and so many people sitting around here. I think that Prophet Ilya must have had the same feelings, but he had something new to say. I'm afraid I won't be able to say anything new what you don't know. I have inquired from Dr. Bird what kind of audience I am meeting, and he enlightened me that mostly it's people who follow the events, who read the serious publications, and who also think for themselves. Well, in any way, I'll try to make some, say a few introductory words, and maybe then we'll have some discussion, because for me it's also very important to sort of have a feeling of audience and discuss matters with people. Oh, Mike? Yes, please. Mike, yes. Does it work? Yeah. Is it better now? Uh-huh. Like that? Okay. Maybe it can, yes. No, some people say they're 11.6 tall. Yeah, that's all right, yes, yes. Well, I'll try to do my best. And besides, I'm in a sort of sentimental mood. Joe Stern's words make me feel a little bit nostalgic about some better younger days which we spent together in London. And nowadays we live, I'm afraid, in very much changed a world which has become really even more dangerous than it used to be. When I was heading on the highway from Washington to Baltimore, I was thinking what I was going to talk about. To speak about the results of the Congress would be impossible. I brought, of course, a report by Secretary General with me. It's got 143 pages. As you know, he delivered it for about 5.5 hours. Well, in any case, I would concentrate my attention on what I think is very much important and which concerns the Soviet Union and the United States. As far as other parts of the reports of the General Secretary are concerned, I think you can read in today's Baltimore Sun a rather balanced, I think, point of view by Mr. Hart from Research Service of the Congress, who is long and well-known specialist on Soviet economic affairs. But then perhaps we also discuss these matters later in the course of questions and answers. So when I was heading for Baltimore, I heard over the radio about this Challenger, new developments of finding the parts of the Challenger. And again, into my mind came a thought. Suppose I'm standing on the rostrum in Baltimore in this hall, and above our heads, you know, space stations, manned and unmanned, are circling, as well as systems of weapons have been developed already in space, and they're also circling above our heads at the distance of no more than 100 miles above. And suppose in these circumstances one of the spaceships, let it be American or let it be Soviet one, falls and explodes. What are the consequences of this? There won't be no time at all for a human factor in this event, because immediately each side whose spaceship was exploded, whose ship exploded, wouldn't even have time for considering what happened, because computers would decide what to do. They will give command to the strike systems, and the catastrophe is immediate, practically immediate. That's why I think that the Soviet Union, and not only the people in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Union I mean the government and the people, in this country also a lot of people, including very well-known specialists. Well, I'm sure that you read, for example, such a magazine as Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. They point out to this danger of this program of Star Wars. Let alone all the political implications, let's just concentrate on this potential danger, what is expecting maybe not all of us sitting here, but our children and our grandchildren and the planet Earth itself. And that's why General Secretary Gorbachev devoted so much attention in his report to the problems of arms control. In a very short words, I will outline this program. This program consists of various phases. Phase 1 is to stop all nuclear testing. And again, I think that this is not only well understood in the Soviet Union, but in this country it is well understood too. It's easiest thing to really have new beginning. Because agreement to stop all nuclear testing means in the first place that we have achieved something, let's say, agreement-wise. Second, it will prevent both superpowers from modernizing existing weapons and from creating new ones, including, of course, weapons which are meant for so-called strategic defense initiative. As you know, initially, this initiative was introduced as a means of liberating the world of nuclear weapons. But not further than yesterday, one of our correspondents asked Mr. Larry Sims, one of the spokesmen of the White House, what he really thinks about this Star Wars program. Is it going to be nuclear or not? Is it really going to liberate the world from nuclear weapons? He said he didn't know. But Secretary Weinberger and his assistant, Mr. Pearl, made it a couple of days before it quite clear that this system needs nuclear energy, especially for nuclear-pumped nuclear laser beams. So it's going to be nuclear. How, with the nuclear program, you're going to liberate the world from nuclear weapons? This question still is very complicated and is not answered by American side. So this is, as I will point out again, the prohibition of all nuclear explosions is not only very valuable from the point of view of making real progress on the way to reducing weapons and eliminating them eventually, but it's also easiest to control. Specialists all over the world, in many other countries, including, of course, the Soviet Union and the United States, agree that it's the easiest things to control. Nowadays, if you read reports by, for example, the United States, seismologic service, they register explosions all over the world and very easily distinguish between the earthquakes and nuclear explosions. And from the technical point of view, there is absolutely no problem in distinguishing between these two kinds of tremors caused by the earth tremors, earthquakes, and by the nuclear explosions under the surface of the earth. And besides that, the Soviet Union has declared that it is ready to negotiate system of controlling and checking on the spot, on the territory of the Soviet Union and on the territory of the United States. So this is phase 1. Phase 2, which was introduced, which was confirmed at the Congress. It was introduced in General Secretary's speech on the 15th of January, envisages gradual reduction by 50% of strategic nuclear weapons and elimination of medium-range weapons in Europe, which American side was proposing itself earlier. But when the Soviet Union agreed to this proposal, the American side immediately put forward a counter-proposal. They said, okay, United States is eliminating its medium-range weapons in Europe. The Soviet Union must eliminate these kind of weapons in Europe and in Asia too. while Americans would still have Okinawa base, which has, you know that this is after Clark's Field and Subic Bay in Philippines, is the largest United States strategic base in the world. So it looks like this proposal was made in the spirit that it will not be accepted by the Soviet Union. You know, I've been working in Washington for 2 years by now, and well, I have to do or try to do my job. We are covering White House, we are covering State Department, Congress, all the debates in Congress, and you know very well that recently House adopted resolution number 3, calling the executive power to start immediately negotiations with the Soviet Union on stopping the on comprehensive test ban treaty, and this resolution was not listened to, let's put it in this way, by the administration. It was non-binding resolution, of course. And the longer I work here, the longer I watch how the wheels of power are turning in Washington, what kind of advice the administration gets, or rather what kind of advice administration listens to, make me feel that in this capital city of this great country, the wheels of power are not turning in the direction of having any agreement with the Soviet Union under any pretext. For me, it's very difficult to judge, of course, how things will develop further on, because I also have a feeling, and not only feeling and impression, but also I also observe and I read and I talk to people that the pressure for making some really constructive and realistic steps in the direction of starting really the process of reducing weapons, reducing the danger of the world, reducing the danger of some accident, which, as I was saying, the catastrophe with the Challenger spaceship underlined once again. You know that computers didn't show anything, that anything was wrong with the Challenger. So computers are bound to make mistakes today, and the more complicated they are. It's not my opinion, I'm not a specialist on computers, but that's what specialists say. The more complicated things are, the greater the possibility of false signals and of miscalculation, etc. Even we in the news business, we do have we have computers in our offices, and we send our reports, say, to Moscow directly via display terminals and computers, and not a single week will pass without some fault in this computer. You either do not get message from Moscow, or your message to Moscow is lost, or your computer, instead of writing in English, and when you switch it into Russian, he writes in Russian, suddenly he starts writing in German. And when you try to find out from the specialists, well, why of all the languages in German? Why not in French? Why not in Arabic? They say, we don't know. It is not programmed to neither of these languages. It's only programmed for Russian and for English. And he doesn't believe you until he comes to the office and looks. He says, well, I don't know. So world really has become very, very complicated. Our countries have a lot of differences. Our ideologies are very different. Our attitude to many, things in day-to-day life are very different. But I think, with some effort we can overcome some differences, or at least we can come to some agreements on problems which concern both of us, and without, of course, imposing on each other trying to impose on each other our wills. I think that's the best way to cooperate. I don't think we ever will be able to be buddies, you know, kiss each other on cheeks when we meet, but we can, well, you know, think hard about some problems which concern not only both of us. We are not isolated in the world, and this is, you know, judging by my experience, I have a feeling that in this country still there is a lot, quite a great a layer of not only politicians but population who still cannot sort of adjust their thinking to the modern times. They still think about this country in rather nostalgic terms, like Joe Stern and myself are thinking about our work in London when we were very young and active, and everything was interesting for us. They still think that America is far away from all the continents. It's surrounded by the oceans, and it's safe, and it's powerful economically, militarily. It can, you know, handle any crisis which arises. Some serious even politicians introduce various doctrines like limited nuclear war, like various thresholds after which you use tactical nuclear weapons, then you use a couple of strategic rockets, missiles, and then you telephone the guy in the Kremlin saying, we are using only 2, please don't use more. Unfortunately, well, this is, of course, well, I exaggerate slightly, but this kind of thinking, I'm afraid, with the coming into the Washington corridors of power of great many people from, well, let's say, less enlightened establishments in this country, this kind of thinking tends to prevail. And this, I think, is very dangerous. If it was only dangerous for the United States, I would myself say, well, that's your own business. You sort of try to handle it yourself, but it's dangerous for the Soviet Union, and it's dangerous for the rest of the world. Well, maybe, fortunately, up till now, the, you know, more sober attitudes did prevail. We're still not having any really serious crisis which would already, you know, nearing the threshold when it is cannot be controlled anymore. But we are not guaranteed that this crisis will not happen in the future. And it depends, by the way, not only on the United States and on the Soviet Union. I've just read in my Washington office, they sent to me from Roosevelt Foundation a very interesting book on matter of proliferation of nuclear weapons. And they have counted 12 countries which are potentially absolutely able tomorrow, if they want to, start producing nuclear weapons. And in 10 years, these weapons will be so miniaturized that they could be used by terrorists. So here is another, so to say, perspective facing us in very near future. And if we start, I mean the Soviet Union, the United States, start really handle this problem in a very urgent manner and in a very serious one, and agree to stop in the beginning to prohibit all the nuclear tests, it will be a lot easier to control the proliferation of nuclear weapons, their modernizing, their miniaturizing, and possibly taking together some measures when we both are absolutely convinced that such and such country is stockpiling nuclear weapons, and it cannot stockpile them without having some explosions. Otherwise, it wouldn't know if this weapon will work or not. And perhaps taking measures, well, I don't know, maybe through United Nations, maybe on bilateral basis. It's already a matter of negotiations and attitude of the world community, of whose opinion, of course, we should take always into account, but take some measures to prevent this happening. So as far as control and reduction of armaments, that's what I think is most important result of the 27th Congress of the party. As far as domestic affairs are concerned, I'm sure that you read, as I mentioned already, Mr. Hart's article. I can add a lot to it, of course. Of course, we do have problems, and well, it reminds me about meeting between patient and doctor. When patient comes and says, "Doctor, I have problems." Doctor stands up, shakes his hand, and says, "My dear friend, I congratulate you. Those who don't have problems, they're usually dead." Perhaps, Mr. Chairman, you told me not to speak for too long a time, and I obey orders, of course. Maybe then let's start discussion.
Well, we thank you very much for your presentation. Mr. Turkatenko will answer questions until 10 minutes after 7. If I may repeat the question was whether our guest would comment upon Dr. Frank's proposal that the Soviet Union and the United States might concentrate upon supranational goals. Would you comment upon that or add perhaps to the examples already mentioned by Dr. Busky?
Well, right now, well-known astronomer Dr. Sagan is in Moscow, and he meets various people there, mostly from academic circles, but also from the government circles, and he puts forward his idea about United States and the Soviet Union cooperating in organizing manned flight to Mars. This is being covered by the Soviet press, and generally it receives a very positive reception in the Soviet Union. Besides that, there are very many spheres of cooperation, of problems which go beyond our national borders. This has been widely discussed in the Soviet press, in the academic circles. When I was editing that journal which my friend Joe Stern mentioned, we did write quite a bit on these problems and on possible directions of Soviet-American cooperation on this. And we did start cooperation in many fields with the United States. We started cooperation on controlled thermonuclear reaction as a source of energy. We started cooperation in fighting against heart diseases, against cancer. It's just example of some fields of cooperation. But unfortunately, the present administration terminated all this cooperation and doesn't show at all any wish to start this cooperation anew or find any other fields of cooperation. And of course, you just name it. It's pollution of air, it's pollution of ocean. It's just very recently, only recently, dawned upon us. I think this is a very great problem. Tur Heyerdahl, you know, of course, this gentleman of the high seas. He warned about this about 5 years ago, when, or was it 7 years ago, when he was traveling on his sugarcane raft from Egypt to, I don't remember the destination. And he did find that the ocean itself was polluted already. And it, of course, affects the biosphere, the whole biosphere of our Earth. So there is a lot of possibilities and fields of cooperation. As far as defense against accidental launch of nuclear missile with the help of Star Wars program, I don't think any serious specialist believes in this possibility, because as I was saying, if you have systems up above in the space, it's very difficult to say what you first have to control, either those systems or possibilities of some accidental launch, and these systems, as I was mentioning and underlining, would be controlled by computers. And I think that if such systems would exist, let it be Soviet or let it be American, they would greatly endanger the existence of all of us. So I think that we can cooperate on any defensive measures. Maybe it's, early warning stations in the space, but not developing, not introducing weapons into the space. Otherwise, it will just repeat itself. In this country, many people believed that the better weapon this country develops, produces, and deploys, the more safe it will be. First it was atomic bomb, then it was hydrogen bomb, then it was multiple warheads, then it was sea-launched missiles, then it was mobile missiles, etc. But it's a very simple physical law. Each action immediately produces counteraction. It's point one. Point two, as any military specialist will point out, there is no distinction between offensive and defensive weapon. Weapons are weapons. So the problem is that the better and more sophisticated systems of weapons any country develops, and in this case it was always, I underline always, the United States who initiated these weapons, and Soviet Union always was following, not initiating them. The security of this country greatly diminished. It has ceased to become invulnerable. And this situation cannot be altered with any new developments, because nowadays, of course, the Soviet Union economically may be weaker than the United States, and it can be weaker in the technology field, as far as I don't know, various other walks of life are concerned, like trade, I don't know, like these calculators, like computer at schools, etc. But we can concentrate, and you know that our space program is not less effective than the program of the United States. It is being developed on different paths, but it's a very sophisticated problem. And I just know it that, again, I judge my opinion on the reading of, works of specialists, that in the modern world it is impossible for any single country to make such a push that to leave far behind any other developed country in any field, especially in the field of weapons. Well, I hope I did answer the question.
Professor Friedman. Many of us greeted with great enthusiasm the comments of Mr. Gorbachev after the summit that now the world is a little bit safer. I think many Soviet citizens as well as American citizens welcome such a comment. Yet you yourself have just stated that there's no difference between really an offensive weapon and a defensive weapon, and that being the case, how does the Soviet Union justify, after the summit, when Mr. Gorbachev said the world would be a little safer, sending SAM-5 missiles to Libya, a country which we both know is one of the less responsible countries in the world?
You see, I think what General Secretary Gorbachev had in mind when he said that, well, after summit, world has become a little bit safer, what he had in mind that, well, atmosphere for some period of time really did change very noticeably. And sort of people, you know, were having new hopes that things will be developing in this direction further and more actively. And why really world is safe, more or less, up till now, on today. I think this is safe because the United States and the Soviet Union, well, they may be sort of, they have no right to play any, I think, special, let alone dominating role in the world. They are just two countries out of 153 countries in the world. But, well, Wollens Nolens, they are most powerful in military might. So they have achieved parity, or rather the Soviet Union has achieved parity. You know about this expression, this abbreviation, MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. So when two most powerful in military aspect countries have achieved parity in military might, it makes it impossible for any of them to strike first. It means that there will be no second strike. And until this parity is not violated, and this parity can be preserved, but on lower level, and maybe gradually in some time on the level without nuclear weapons at all. But there is no need to higher this, to make it high a level, introducing new and new systems of weapons, because parity, once achieved, will stay. But with introducing new and new systems of weapons, it will be more and more unstable, because today one side will make some new system, another side will be, you know, very actively producing and very nervous before it introduces the same system or counter system. So it's better to stop on this level. As far as disseminating weapons across the world, the trouble is that there was some very hopeful sign in this field too some years ago. The Soviet Union and the United States did start negotiations about controlling arms sales and deliveries of sophisticated system of arms to various other countries. The United States unilaterally and abruptly walked out of these talks. They said that we would be selling and giving arms to anybody whom we deem possible and necessary. Well, what else? What are we going to do if the United States declares that this is the right of the, well, this is very typical an attitude on the part of the United States. What is allowed to Jupiter is not allowed to its bull. Unfortunately, nowadays, it's, you know, impossible to behave in the world on the basis of this ancient proverb. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, but there are two Jupiters in the world in this respect. So they should cooperate, they should negotiate. And if the United States thinks that it can sell or deliver arms to anybody it deems necessary, well, we're sorry. We have the right to do the same.
This week, the Baltimore Sun is running a series of articles on Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. Can you tell me what the goals of the Soviet Union are in Afghanistan, and when we can look forward to seeing the withdrawal of all Soviet troops from that country?
You know, it's a very complicated problem indeed, and it's a very painful problem. And again, I should remind you that May 14th, 1980, as you remember, Soviet troops were invited to Afghanistan by the Babrak government, in December 1979. So, in any case, this government, together with the Soviet Union, proposed that Afghanistan stays neutral country, and the Soviet Union and the United States guarantee its neutrality. So this did not happen, of course, and how the things will turn out, very difficult to say. I think that you're reading articles by Moscow correspondent of the Baltimore Sun, Mr. Piatila. It's series of articles. It's very interesting series of articles. I think it sort of shows the real situation in Afghanistan in many respects. So I personally think that our troops should be withdrawn from there as soon as possible, provided the United States, Pakistan, stop interfering into the Afghan affairs. You know that this country, this administration has spent already nearly $1 billion of money through CIA. It was not officially authorized by the Congress to buy equipment, military equipment for Afghans who are based on the territory of Pakistan. In Pakistan itself, situation is also very, very unstable. Somehow American press is not covering it, but in Pushtun province there is virtually war between Pashtuns and the Pakistani army. So this situation is very difficult, and Afghanistan is much closer to us than, say, Nicaragua to the United States, about which Mr. Reagan each and every day pronounces various threats, and this country is providing weapons and training, etc., to the Contras. He explains it that Nicaragua threatens the security of the United States. As I was saying, I am not comparing, of course, Nicaragua and Afghanistan, but I should underline that it's our immediate neighbor, and we would like to have stable situation in this country. And it cannot be stable until the United States and Pakistan, which of course does it on the American orders, stop interfering into the affairs of Afghanistan. Until this stops, the Soviet troops will be there.
Two recent books about the Soviet Union, one by Richard Pipes, who's a professor of Russian history at Harvard University, and one by Michael Vojlinsky, former professor in the Academy of Sciences in Moscow. He's now the director of the Institute of Contemporary Soviet Research in Munich. They talk at length about a ruling class in the Soviet Union. Volinsky's book, entitled Nomenklatura, is very specific. Would you please comment about the historical character of the nomenklatura, and what, if anything, Mr. Gorbachev will do to reduce its power? In the editorial which you already mentioned, Mr. Hart's editorial in this morning's Baltimore Sun, Mr. Hart states that revising the nomenklatura may be politically impossible. What do you think?
Mr. Waslensky, this is his correct name, well, he's got to earn his living, so I wouldn't trust very much to what he's writing. And besides, he works in Munich for Radio Free Europe, which employs mostly very, very sort of, or kind of people, well, who sell themselves, to this radio. And, but nevertheless, well, Mr. Pipes, I know him very well. He is very much carried away a person, and thanks God he's not working on the National Security Council anymore. As far as nomenclatura is concerned, nomenclatura, it's a word which very often interpret here as ruling class or whatever it is. Let's be a little bit closer to the earth. What is ruling class? Ruling class is group of people, how I understand it. Well, of course, on the basis of Marxist, Leninist philosophy, etc. Which has real economic and political power, irrespective of the fact if they occupy or not occupy official post. Like take this country, Rockefeller family or Mellon's family or Hunt family or whatever it is. They are really ruling class, the combination of all this wealth, economic wealth. They are ruling class. It doesn't matter if Nelson Rockefeller was vice president or he was just a private citizen. His wealth gives him the possibility to yield the pressure on any organ of power in this country, let alone this country, but on the countries far beyond the United States where American transnational corporations operate. As far as the Soviet Union is concerned, what is exactly nomenclatura? For example, recently, TASS correspondents inside the Russian Federation, Federal Republic, were taken out of nomenclatura of local authorities and placed into the nomenclatura of Central Committee, which means that local authorities cannot pressure the TASS correspondent, any given TASS correspondent. They cannot fire him. They cannot hire him. This decision is taken by TASS together with the Central Committee, which of course strengthens the position of TASS correspondent. He can operate a lot easier. You know that in this country too, media experiences, a lot of pressures from various sides, power centers, let it be in Baltimore or Chicago or anywhere else. So nomenclatura is that a person is appointed to some high-ranking job. In the Republic, he could be appointed by the Council of Ministers of the Republic or Central Committee of the Republic. And it means that no lower body can fire him from his job without any reasons and without demanding it from that body which appointed him. I mean, and I underline appointed. It does not concern elected members of councils and of the party organs. So, unfortunately, some people from this kind of persons, some persons from this kind of, officials, they used their position for their own sort of good or profit or whatever it is. For example, that mostly in our country people get apartments from local councils, from city councils, like say I have apartment in Moscow from Moscow Council. So they would get a good apartment for themselves, and then they would get good apartment for their children and even for grandchildren. These apartments are very inexpensive. Say I pay for a two-bedroom apartment about 28 rubles per month, telephone and hot water and gas and electricity all included. But of course we still have scarcity of good living conditions, and using your official position for obtaining this sort of privileges, it has been done. And that's what Gorbachev is dead against nowadays. Of course, you lose all your power, all your influence, all your privileges when you're fired or not elected to the job, which is major difference between the ruling class in this country and so-called ruling class in the Soviet Union. I again would underline that discussion on the rostrum, on the podium of the 27th Congress on this specific problem was very sharp, and a lot of very high-ranking people were fired, and a lot of them were sued by courts, and of course a lot of property was confiscated because they would use, you know, some various means of obtaining money for buying good, you know, village, what we call dachas. So it was very carefully looked in how they got this money. Was it from their salary or from some willing dealing? So this is a problem which party has faced and is facing, and which it is fighting, because the understanding, not understanding, but the absolutely iron rule should be that person should do his job, not because he wants to have some privileges, but because he wants and able to do his job.
So one assumes that the Soviet Union, like the United States, is interested in obtaining a decent opinion in the eyes of the international community. The recent release of Anatol Sharansky, notwithstanding the fact they're slightly tarnished by the so-called spy exchange, nonetheless did accrue a lot of goodwill, a lot of favorable press toward the Soviet Union. Why is it then, with that tremendous reservoir of goodwill that is potentially there, that the Soviet Union finds it so important not to indulge in a humanitarian gesture like the release of Dr. Sakharov and the refuseniks?
You know, I know this problem. It's being widely discussed in this country, and I recently discussed it with some Mr. Lifshitz, who visited me in my office. He emigrated from Berdichev 2 years ago, and unfortunately he hit the bottom here. He came with his 2 plastic bags, so it was not very envious plight, and I was really very astonished how the Jewish community let him to live in this way. Well, in any case, it's not my business. My business is that the problem of emigration from the Soviet Union is very complicated indeed. But we do have our laws, which were adopted by the Supreme Soviet, and everybody who lives in the Soviet Union must abide to these laws. Another question that sometimes, as you very well know, the law is in the hands of people who either don't know the law itself or they bend it in the way they want to bend it. And in his speech, Secretary General, it's not only in this speech, this process is being going on for some time, that the law must be observed by everybody, including the government, the party, by everybody. The law is for everybody. It should be applied. And you have noticed that some spouses of Americans were given visas to come to the Soviet Union. There is nothing astonishing in it. I don't know this is question of goodwill or not. There is law in the Soviet Union which permits marriages between the Soviet citizens and foreigners. And this law should be observed. And as far as Mr. Sharansky is concerned, well, I know that he was sentenced for speculations with American dollars, and there was, yes, he was receiving, yes, well, that's what I read in the press. I haven't been to the court itself. But you can say anything. You can say anything. You see, you have no proof. I have no details of his trial. You have no proof either. So we can say anything. So this is no sort of way of discussing the problem. I know that he was sentenced for speculating in American dollars and for giving some information to some Americans. I don't know what about. Frankly, I was not following attentively this. I know very many people of Jewish origin in the Soviet Union. A lot of them are my good friends. And I haven't met a single person who told me that he wanted to emigrate and he was not allowed to. So I just haven't heard. But I know that a lot of people have emigrated and are emigrating. So this is not a very simple problem, but they must do it in accordance with the Soviet law, which is absolutely the same for people of any origin, of Jewish, of Tartars, Tartarian or Ukrainian or Russian or whatever it is. So I don't think that, I am very much against anti-Semitism, but I am also very much against of attempts of some people of Jewish origins to put themselves into some special position, as if they're above everybody.
We not only thank you for being with us, but we wish the Soviet Union well in its, to the extent to which it shares with us a quest, an earnest quest, for a stable international order. We appreciate you coming very, very much.
And thank you very much, and I do wish you all well.